הדובר הבא שלנו, פרופסור סרי נוסייבeh, פרופסור לפילוסופיה, לשעבר נשיא אוניברסיטת קודס במזרח ירושלים. במשך שנים ארוכות שימש בתפקידים שונים בפתח ובאש"ף, תפקידו האחרון היה ממונה מטעם אש"ף על מזרח ירושלים. בבקשה.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have to speak in English. It's not a bad language. And these are some thoughts that came to me over the past 3 months, I think. Okay, so I think it's important for us, even as we try to cope mentally and emotionally with the situation unfolding in Gaza, and which we have come to call the war raging there, to ask ourselves what we should be learning from it. There are obviously many lessons to be learned, some that will require more time to be grasped, but let me point out some that already stare us right in the face. The first lesson is that however good or bad we think life was for all sides before the war, it was by any account better for all of them than it has been since. The spiral of violence ignited on October the 7th only worsened people's lives all around. But the second equally glaring lesson is that better situation, as has by now been confirmed, clearly had all the subjective and objective hallmarks of planning for and igniting the war. Now, this immediately undermines from the value of the first lesson, making it seem to be telling us that the path directly and determinately taking us to fall over the edge is better than eventually falling, which is hardly a solace. The third lesson, also clear from the first moment and for everyone to see, is that this war quickly set ablaze conflictual values and instincts latent in us about how we perceive each other, good as well as bad, only to discover that, despite the violence used and the pain suffered, the war leaves those conflictual feelings within us simmering and unresolved. And finally, it makes us wonder, given what we know about wars between countries, as it was, for example, in 1967, whether this really was a war to begin with. Without mutually accepted state boundaries, it has all the hallmarks of being an internal fight within the same country, rather than a war between countries. Now, in addition to the lessons mentioned, the war also raises many questions that we need to ask ourselves. Returning to our values and instincts and looked upon from the Israeli side, do we really see it as a war with Hamas, as it may have begun, or is it with the Palestinians? And looked at from the Palestinian side, is it a war against Israel or against the occupation? Is it underneath all that really a war Israel is engaged in with itself and is still unresolved? A war, similarly, Palestinians are engaged in with themselves and is still unresolved. A war, specifically, about whether the life lived so far is really the life desired. If this war is or has come to reflect an instinctual conflict about whether the life lived is the life one wants, its real battleground clearly cannot be a geographical terrain nor can the enemy in it be someone outside of ourselves. Perhaps, in other words, the decisive battle that needs to be waged and resolved is not in Gaza, but in us, and only once it is that it can then be decided whether the war against Hamas or the army has been won or lost to the satisfaction of one side or the other. Now, the outer war we see raging already tells us, of course, that the inner war, that of whether this is really the kind of life we want, for better or worse, is to all practical intents already settled for the major players involved. The outer war seems to be settled for the people. There's no problem on either side about the kind of life and the consequences of living that life that they have to go through. But how settled is it in theory and across the entire spectrum of the two peoples? Surely the existential question that must prop up in everyone's minds at some time or another, whichever side we are on, and regardless of whether it is heeded or ignored, is whether we wish to live what is in effect the life of the narratives we have about ourselves at whatever cost, or create our own narrative. Whether our lives should be about the most we can get for ourselves, or about the best we can make of ourselves. Indeed, this is a very difficult question to make, whether to submit ourselves to a preconceived narrative of who we are, or to make one anew, to be total slaves of some idea we have been born and reared with, or be masters of ideas that conform more to reason and common sense. As slaves, we continue the war, even to extinction of ourselves or of the other. Looking at the turmoil present and at an undefined period ahead, the outlook does not encourage the hope that a radical self-emancipation by both sides that can free them to become masters of themselves is about to happen. As it seems, both sides are busying themselves with arranging for what they view as a preferred day after, that is, for how to return to the status quo ante, or to those shells each of them has been bloodily trying to push the other out of. In all likelihood, they will both achieve a limited success. If managing to return to one's cocoon and to retrieve one's delusional self-image can be considered a success. In this scenario, each side will find itself blindly preparing for the next catastrophe or for the march to the next precipice. But never mind, the war of illusions can continue. It has become common wisdom to say Madrid-Oslo was both a mistake and a failure. While evidentially a failure, that it was a mistake is far from clear. After all, it stood as a summit of hope for a rearticulation of each side of its self-image, a courageous effort to exercise a mastery over oneself, and of the two sides willing to exchange, making the most with making the best of themselves. Failures should not be looked at as conclusive ends. They can be learned from, and future mistakes avoided. Some of you who have reached my age, not many of you maybe, will still remember that picture taken in Gaza on the eve of the Madrid talks of a young Intifada activist who peacefully stood atop an Israeli tank, raising both an olive tree in one hand and the Palestinian flag in the other. The smiling head and shoulders of the Israeli tank's officer showing alongside. The pictures we see today of how Hamas militants approach Israeli tanks stand in sharp contrast, as does the creeping shadow of death by starvation. A week or so ago, Israeli drones killed and wounded 6 young activists in Nur Shams refugee camp in the West Bank. I recall from that same period in the early 90s, the Oslo years, I recall from that period convoys of cars swarming out of Nur Shams in the wake of a large peace rally in the football field there, with Palestinian flags flapping out of their windows. Wait a minute. I should put my reading glasses on, I think. Do you mind? Now, I think most of what I read, what I was saying, actually was reading. I did a cataract, so I can see from afar, but not. Okay, so here we are. Okay, so I recall the swarm of cars, the cars swarming out from the camp. As the first car was sighted and abruptly stopped by Israeli soldiers, the hearts of the people in the cars behind stopped momentarily, unsure if war was about to erupt so soon again. So this was a convoy of cars coming out from the rally. And everybody was happy, you know, Madrid, peace. And so the Palestinian flags being raised, and cars were coming out. And then there was an army, people standing in the road that stopped the first car. And everybody in the cars behind sort of, were worried that the soldiers were going to stop the continuation of the rally. But no, it turned out the soldiers were making sure the wind-flapping Palestinian flag just did not wrap itself around the front windscreen. The flag was it was a sheet, a bed sheet, made into a flag, and it was sort of, out of the window, and it was flapping in front of the windscreen. And so what the soldiers were doing were telling the driver and the people inside the car to put it in such a way that it wouldn't cause damage or create an accident. Now, I think these were the many moments like this that I remember. These were rare moments when soldiers and activists saw and dealt with each other heart to heart. These were the moments which Madrid-Oslo created and which we must relish with unfaltering hope. But Oslo left the future open for any walk-in players. Eventually, the playing field turned into a quagmire. Will the day after turn out to be such a field? It looks that way, as the two sides seek to re-entrench themselves into their former shells, each side still unable to free itself from its preset self-narrative, unable to see humanity beyond itself. The aforesaid wars within us, after all, are much deeper and more ingrained than to be rightly blamed on this person or partly or that. They have come to define who we are, to chain us to how we are. Now, seeing this, and perhaps also an opportunity to set the future straight, or fearing the spread of wildfire that might burn up their concerns or interests, international and regional players have also busied themselves with the so-called day after. Different configurations are envisaged, perhaps even negotiated behind closed doors, and are ready for delivery or implementation once the fighting subsides. Some of these, looking at the larger picture, are suggesting that the day after setup should be a transitional international intervention that is pinned to a two-state solution as an outcome that will offer a better life to the two sides. Different versions of such a solution can be and have over time been visualized that can address the different parties' concerns and needs. In any case, these suggestions insist that a successful mechanism in any well-meaning process to set matters right must, unlike the case was with Oslo, spell out in advance where the process is headed. This ensures that the playing field will not end up being another quagmire. In any case, it should be clear that the alternatives to introducing such a mechanism in the long run will leave us where we were before this latest war. We are still too much two separate peoples, each struggling against the other for self-fulfillment. And the regime of full civil rights, let alone a one-man, one-vote single-state system, still seems like a far-off dream. We would therefore, and for a long time, be left with internecine conflicts that will simply feed extremism on both sides and lead to ends that are far worse than what we have witnessed so far. But should we avoid all that simply by waiting for a preemptive international intervention, or conversely by preparing ourselves for the next confrontation? Now I want to put before you an offbeat scenario. Now this is a strange one, comes off my head only, where Israel surprisingly outdoes everyone else's initiatives and takes the lead to bringing peace about. Though some will argue that such an Israeli initiative might show weakness, I believe it will have all the hallmarks of wisdom and strength. In a rationally confident step, it declares a one-sided ceasefire, repositioning its troops in outlying areas in Gaza, and declares a conditional commitment to a future two-state solution whose form will be negotiated with a future democratically elected Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian territories. It will welcome the participation of international parties to oversee a 3-year interim period of Palestinian self-governance and reconstruction, but to ensure at the same time the demilitarization of the prospective territory of the Palestinian state. It will leave the question of the formation of an interim Palestinian self-governance for the Palestinians themselves to decide on. But all will be predicated, once the ceasefire is declared, A, on the immediate all-for-all exchange of hostages and prisoners through the Red Cross, and B, the immediate lifting of restrictions on food and medicine into Gaza. These two preambles are guaranteed to start the process rolling. This way, Israel will remain in control of the transformational process from beginning to end, while at the same time giving Palestinians space for hope in the future and the sense that their deaths and suffering has not been in vain. Furthermore, Israel may, through such an initiative, wipe off its maligned image in the international arena. The ball now will be on the Palestinian side to decide on the next move, and on the international community to assume the role offered it. With the prisoner exchange and an Israeli ceasefire, Hamas will no longer have a stated target to justify continued fighting, while the flooding of food and medications, together with the promise of a return to a semi-normal life, will reinforce a shift in public mood. During the 3-year period, which the Palestinian side will see the benefit of and will therefore look forward to, there will be enough time for the Palestinians to engage in an open public debate about what sort of political platform they would wish an elected government to run on, if that will be one that is committed to the two-state solution. Unlike the situation was in the past, this time round the path to be taken and the end to reach will be set out as one integrated package. Any significant breach in the former preempting the reach to the latter. And lest past mistakes be repeated, the response of Palestinians must be theirs, and it must be the product of a deep soul-searching process in which the critical mass of the population will decide to articulate their own new national narrative, one that, as already would have happened in Israel with the suggested initiative, forgoes the most for the best. Here again, then, a public emancipation from a self-narrative to being masters of a new future will be required and hopefully realized. All this will be worth doing, and it can be done. Israelis and Palestinians can, in this way, help each other to make peace, both within themselves and with each other. And that's it. Thank you very much.